Minister, I'd like to welcome this bill today, and on a personal note I would like to say congratulations. I know what it's taken for you to get this bill to this point, and I know it's a big milestone for you, so I would like to just acknowledge that. And I also want to acknowledge the work that was done by the Climate Committee, chaired by Deputy Ledden. You know, the work that we did, we came together, we did serious analysis and listened to the experts, and I think the work that we did has strengthened the bill. I would also like to clarify that the discussions we had with the experts were not in private, as was stated earlier on, and the Climate Committee will continue to work on this legislation and continue to work on these issues, and I would welcome other deputies to actually attend those meetings, so when they are talking to their constituents that they're armed with the actual facts and not misleading people in relation to the impact of this bill on communities. This week, I do think we need to look at this bill in the context of what's happened this week. This week, the World Meteorological Society has said that 2020 is the third hottest year on record. Next year, it is forecast that emissions will take the second highest rise in figures since the records began. And the UN General Secretary has said that we are standing on the edge of the abyss when it comes to climate change. So I think the question for us here today is this bill enough to pull us back from that edge? Is it strong enough? Is it ambitious enough? And I don't believe it is. I think we can go much further, and the Social Democrats believe that we can go much further. In relation to targets, I think we first need to dispel the myth that this revised draft bill will be the most progressive in the world in terms of implementing targets in primary legislation. Denmark has set a 70% target of emissions reductions by 2030 in legislation, while the UK has committed to putting in place a 78% target by 2035. We are no longer progressive. In fact, we are behind the curve on this. A target of net zero emissions by 2050 is simply too late. It's out of step with scientific advice and far short of our fair share of the global effort needed to deliver on the Paris Agreement. This must be the floor and not the ceiling of our ambition. Professors Andrew Jackson, John Sweeney and Barry McMullen have recently indicated the issue of predatory delay in a letter to you, Minister, suggesting that the bill referencing the 7% annual emissions target as transposed in Section 6A(5) is legally unclear, permitting multiple conflicting interpretations, none of which is strongly supported by the text. I do welcome your commitment, Minister. I believe that you're going to clarify that issue, and I hope that you will bring forward some amendments in relation to that at committee stage. Furthermore, there are some weaknesses in the bill that give a degree of discretion to ministers when keeping in line with carbon budgets, and no penalties if targets are missed or if the budgets are exceeded, and this urgently needs to be addressed at later stages of the bill. The other thing we need to be cognizant of is that we can't be talking out of both sides of our mouths in addressing this issue of climate change, and the government cannot do it. I think the intentions in the bill must be reflected on the ground, and it must be reflected in policy and in strong policy. But it does not seem to be happening when it comes to fossil fuel and gas infrastructure. Now, I do welcome, I think the Minister is going to bring amendments at committee stage in relation to exploration, but despite the commitment, I'm going to talk now about the frack gas infrastructure, despite the commitment in the programme for government for a ban on the importation of frack gas and the development of LNG infrastructure, applications for LNG development continue to take place. We've been waiting for a policy statement for over 10 months now, and it's time that the Minister commits here today that that statement will be made, and commits to issuing the statement before any new applications are in train. It's time for the Government to reaffirm its commitment to ban the importation of fracked gas by referencing this explicitly in the bill as an amendment going forward. It was an explicit commitment made by the Greens when you entered government, but we have yet to see any progress on that, and particularly in conjunction with the bill as that moves forward. As we begin a decade in which global emissions must decrease by half if the 1.5% limit set out in the Paris Agreement is to remain viable, there is no scientific justification for the continued investment and the continued subsidisation of new fossil fuel infrastructure. This bill is a motherboard for overall governance and accountability measures so that we can hold the government to account no matter who is in power. And I think, Minister, you said that we could be potentially looking at 5 or 6 government terms, and I think that's really important. And when I first looked at this bill...
Thank you, Deputy. I have to interrupt you now, but you'll remain in position after the break.
Okay.
Deputy Whitmore, you were in possession with some considerable time remaining.
Thank you, Ceann Comhairle. I was just talking about the whole issue of governance and accountability when it comes to the climate bill. This bill is a motherboard for overall governance and accountability measures that we can apply to hold the government to account, no matter who is in power. A huge part of our committee report recommendations focused on this issue as well, and I do want to welcome the increased accountability measures dotted throughout the bill as a result of the Minister taking on board the suggestions of the committee. Welcome additions include references to corrective actions where failures occur to meet emissions targets, a section on climate reporting and a requirement that the Minister shall, when preparing a climate action plan, ensure that the plan is consistent with the carbon budget programme. Other welcome aspects of the new bill include the strengthened role of the Climate Change Advisory Council by increasing its members from 11 to 14, and the provisions that future appointments to the Council provide for a greater range of relevant expertise, including ecological expertise, which I was particularly keen on seeing in there. But do these improvements go far enough? Will they ensure that all arms of the state are working in tandem together to reduce emissions and meet our national and international targets? Firstly, the reporting lag inherent in the bill will need to be tackled. The Advisory Committee has a year after the expiry of a carbon budget to propose a new one. The Minister also has 4 months to consider and amend the carbon budget and lay it before the Oireachtas. The Dáil Committee may also be set up to consider the carbon budget and make recommendations within 2 months. Therefore, carbon budgets will be set up based on previous 5-year period, potentially 2 to 3 years after the commencement of the relevant period. And there is the issue of too much front-loading on one department in our response to climate change, rather than the burden being shared equally across all departments and agencies of the state. I think we have this cultural thing where we compartmentalise the environment. We set the environment aside. We set it aside from economic development. We set it aside from transport. We set it aside from roads, where in actual fact it needs to be a core component of everything we do within government and in our governance. And accountability must also be shared across all ministers, departments and agencies. And I do believe that Taoiseach really should take a lead role in ensuring the implementation of the carbon bill, because it really is the Taoiseach that will need to show that leadership. And I think what we've seen, particularly over COVID, where we have faced a crisis, there are times that the 3 government partners have worked against each other and have not pulled together as one. And I think that has impacted on community support and in community engagement. And we cannot afford to have something like that similarly happening in relation to the climate crisis. We also need to climate-proof all existing policies and legislation, including international trade deals, which brings me to the most pressing and urgent issue of CETA. How can we expect to validate this climate action bill when at the same time the same government is seeking approval for the investor court system, despite international comparative analysis revealing the threat these investor courts have on countries' ability to regulate for the increased climate and environmental protections? The environmental chapter of CETA is very weak when it comes to legal enforceability, in contrast to the strong provisions to protect investors, and any references to sustainability, environmental protection and adherence to international climate agreements are only aspirational and voluntary in nature. The combination of weak environmental protections as contained in CETA and the large payouts resulting from existing dispute mechanisms to large energy companies reveals that the environment has the most to lose from the new investor court system, which forces national governments to pull back on ambitious climate action policies and legislations. And we have real-time and real-world examples of this happening, and it's not something that we can ignore. The threat of being sued under an investor court system as created by CETA has the potential to create a chilling effect on government's ability or government's willingness to implement policy in the interest of the public good or in the interest of the environmental good. I am happy to see the inclusion of a definition of biodiversity and nature-based solutions and its inclusion in the Climate Action Plan and the long-term climate objective, and this is something that I've been pushing since elected, and I also welcome the fact that the amendments that I put into the NORA bill have been transposed and will be taken into account in this bill, and I think that's a really positive move. However, I do think we could go further in this, and I do think we need to go further. I think there needs to be an establishment of clear objectives in support of the conservation and the sustainable use of biodiversity at the core of legislation. Other countries have done it very successfully, such as Costa Rica. And that country has managed to provide a broad and a multifaceted objective in its legislation, which focuses on the integration of biodiversity into policies and into the state's decision-making processes. In Ireland, our approach has been to date it's to develop separate plans, separate reports, separate actions for biodiversity and climate change. And we can see a widening gap happen between biodiversity and climate action, with little communication between the two processes, and I think that's something that we need to absolutely work hard against. In relation to just transition, I know other deputies have also mentioned this, but really none of this will be achievable if we don't bring communities along with us, and we don't bring those who will be most impacted by any climate actions, if we don't bring them on board and support them to make the changes that they need to make. The Climate Committee made some very strong suggestions in relation to just transition, and unfortunately that has not been translated into this bill. In fact, there is quite a significant get-out clause, I think, in the section on just transition, where it says insofar as practical, and I do think that's something that we need to strengthen. I mean, we've seen today and we've heard in the media over the last 2 days how, you know, some politicians are really going to cause confusion and scaremonger when it comes to rural and other communities in relation to the climate bill, and we cannot allow for that to happen. And we need to make sure that people understand, firstly, that we have to do this, we have to address these things, but that while we're doing it, we will not leave them behind, and that the policies we put in place and the funding we put in place will focus on those that most need government support. And I think that's key, and that's really where we need to be bringing just transition. We also need to make sure that we have significant consultation when we're talking about our policies, and this is something I've raised with you previously, Minister. You know, in relation to, say, the waste bill, you know, there was no poverty proofing of that. There was no one, I think there was 40 people on the stakeholder committee. There was no one who represented those at risk of poverty, and there was no one there from a grassroots disability perspective. And I think that's going to be key, that we make sure that we hear those voices when we're developing policies on this issue. Another recommendation was to have the requirement for public consultation when preparing the long-term national climate action strategy, and democratic participation of civil society has slowly been eroded over time, particularly in relation to the cost of judicial reviews or appeals. Civil society receive minimal amount of funding to be spending it on costly barriers that make it harder for them to protect and preserve the environment, and this is something that we need to be very, very conscious of. So adequate consultation will ensure that the action plans are poverty-proofed to ensure just transition is carried out at each stage. And I do want to at this stage mention the draft forestry bill, which in its preliminary form threatened to curb the rights of individuals and environmental organisations to appeal as a way to address the administrative failings of the current appeal system. This is not how we would envisage the just transition. In fact, we should be strengthening the rights of those who guard our natural environment. We should be appreciating the work they put into protecting our environment and our communities. Democracy and transparency are cornerstones of climate action, which is why the committee's recommendation to include references to the Aarhus Convention is an important one as well. People on low incomes must be able to afford their minimum energy needs. This can be achieved by ensuring people have an adequate income benchmarked against the cost, and controlling the cost of utilities for low-income households as we make the transition to renewables via social tariffs or price caps. We need to expand access to free energy efficiency upgrades and focusing on those living in social housing and private rental accommodation, and investing in public transport and rural transport, and particularly looking at the availability or the potential for free public transport. And I think in particular rolling out things like local link infrastructure to facilitate local and rural communities, which I think is absolutely vital. Unfortunately, the current retrofitting programme is not on course to meet the energy needs of those most vulnerable to transition. Currently, there is a very long waiting list for people applying for Warmer Homes Energy Grant to retrofit their homes. And this disadvantages certain groups of people, including the elderly. To date, 142,000 homes have received free upgrades, but there are currently 7,800 homes awaiting works on the Warmer Homes Scheme programme. And there's a 2-year waiting list from the time someone makes their application to when they get a surveyor out. And Minister, I spoke to you about a constituent of mine in Wicklow, a pensioner who has very little money, who is currently spending nearly 900 euro on electricity per her bill in February, and she will probably have a 3-year wait to get that work done. So we need to make sure that people who want to make those changes are facilitated to do it, and facilitated to do it quickly. Legislation may have all the best intentions, but where Ireland consistently falls down is implementation. The Government continues to delay in developing the necessary legislative framework to allow for green energy to be harnessed, developed and disseminated to households and businesses across the country, in line with our 70% target for renewable energy production by 2030. The Irish Wind Energy Association predicts we could miss our 2030 targets if existing barriers to planning and grid connections are not resolved quickly enough. And this is why the Marine Planning Bill must be introduced. But again, we need to take into account environmental considerations, and I know there are a lot of concerns and claims that we're actually putting the cart before the horse here. We have not yet established our marine protected areas. We have not looked ecologically to see what sections of our maritime resource we should be protecting before we start putting the infrastructure in. And I would like to see progress being made in that regard. Government needs to get to work on the RES auctions and the accompanying guidelines to facilitate these large-scale developments. And the Minister also needs to clarify the guidelines for developing community funds for wind energy that could really benefit local communities, particularly I'm in my own constituency of Wicklow, there's significant wind farm applications going in offshore. I also want to touch on the issue of energy-heavy industries such as data centres, which is a sector that continues to grow in Ireland. Data centres are currently responsible for 1.5% of Ireland's carbon emissions, but they are projected to use nearly 30% of Ireland's total energy by 2028. EirGrid has warned that by 2026, the twin demands of data centres and electric cars could exceed Ireland's energy supply. It cannot be the case that the only real beneficiaries are corporations purchasing renewable energy, with the cost being put onto the Irish state and our own climate if we therefore cannot meet our emissions and renewable energy targets. We need assurances from government that our move towards a different energy system will not be compromised by growing energy-heavy industries, that our green energy system serves local communities, and that development needs are met in a sustainable way. So implementation will be key, and this bill must be dealt with on an emergency basis. Alongside implementation is the need for the necessary funding to support departments, agencies and local authorities to implement their climate action plans. The Government has had practice. It is dealing with the crisis now. The impact of COVID can be viewed as a test of the economic disruption we want to avoid as a country as we transition to a zero-carbon economy. The hallmarks of the pandemic can be seen carried through a climate emergency, including the need to protect our most vulnerable, apply systemic changes in our economic system and provide proper and effective governance to implement the changes required, with funding allocated to where the needs are most. There is a rhythm and a tempo that accompanies legislation as it passes through the houses of the Oireachtas. It reflects the urgency that the Government assigns to the issues at hand. In the case of this bill, however, Minister, the tempo is out of sync with the reality it attempts to address. This once-in-a-generation, generation-defining piece of legislation has not consistently met with the sense of urgency that climate change and the biodiversity crisis brings. The bill veers towards a safer, more measured rhythm, a result of the compromise between the very opposing sections of government. Climate change and biodiversity loss does not care for compromise, Minister. Compromise is what got us here in the first place. It is now time that we pick up the pace. Thank you.
Thank you very much.